Hi everybody! So you've completed the memory modules. These would be modules 23, 25, and 26. For these modules, I have 3 overall take-home points. It might seem like more, okay? But the first grouping of take-home points actually is associated with encoding, storage, and retrieval, and what type of memory each applies to. Now this, as far as the construal of memory in this case, it is the 3-store memory model or information processing approach. And this approach delineates sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Briefly, sensory memory is like a storage of sensory information prior to that information being processed. So the idea is that our sensations enter sensory memory, but we haven't switched over to perception yet. In other words, we don't know, we're not aware of the information in sensory memory. The idea also is that a lot of information, in fact, all sensory information gets in there, but it also leaks out very quickly. Okay, so that's sensory memory. Short-term memory is also known as working memory. It is where we process information. As far as short-term memory, this is a type of memory that is limited in capacity. In other words, we can only process so much at a given time. Okay? But this is the memory that makes sense of information. This is the memory that is learning information. This is also the memory that is retrieving information from long-term memory. And then finally, long-term memory is our permanent store of information. Essentially, it's our hard drive. It's where we put all of that information that we have learned. In the brain, it would be the association areas. Okay? As related to encoding, storage, and retrieval, what type of memory each applies to? I'll actually start with storage because storage applies to all 3. Sensory memory is like a huge holding bin. Even though information gets out very quickly, it still holds information that comes in. Gets in and then leaks out very, very quickly. As far as storage, it also applies to long-term memory. Long-term memory is a permanent store of information, and many psychologists believe that once information gets into LTM, it's basically there for the long haul. So if you forget something, according to this view, it's still in LTM, you just don't know where you put it. You can't find it. Okay? And then finally, short-term memory is also storage, but short-term memory is the limited in capacity type of storage. So here's where the idea of chunking or grouping information together comes into play. If you chunk information, then you're able to expand your capacity of short-term memory. But the idea is that there's only so many things you can think about at one given moment, at one given time. So that's storage. You also have encoding. Encoding basically is translating information into a form that memory can understand. Encoding does not apply to sensory memory because the information in sensory memory is in an unprocessed form. In other words, we don't understand it yet. Encoding definitely applies to short-term memory. In fact, it's short-term memory that is encoding all the information, that's translating it, that's working on it, putting it in a form that we can remember. As far as long-term memory itself doesn't necessarily encode information. It's short-term memory that is doing the encoding. But long-term memory does contain encoded information. And then finally you have retrieval. As far as retrieval, that again applies to short-term memory because short-term memory is engaging in retrieval, and specifically short-term memory is retrieving from long-term memory. So when we are remembering something, a name or an answer to a question on an exam, what's going on there, according to this 3-store memory model or information processing approach, is that short-term memory is searching long-term memory for the answer. So short-term memory is trying to find and retrieve that information from long-term memory. Okay? So that's your encoding, storage, and retrieval as applied to sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. And that's my overall first take-home point. The second take-home point is the idea of retrieval failure. Okay? So what happens when we can't remember something? One phenomenon is known as pseudo-forgetting. That occurs when you know you've looked at something, so you know you looked at that page in the textbook, you know you looked at your notes, but for the life of you, you can't remember that information. What might have happened there is that while you were looking at the information, so yes, you reviewed it, you did not actually commit that information to long-term memory. Okay? So that's why it's called pseudo-forgetting, because it never got into long-term memory in the first place. It's familiar, but it's not strong enough of a memory for you really to have a good grip on it in LTM. Okay? As far as retrieval failure, another example here is associated with the idea that we got the information into long-term memory, but we just don't know where we put it. Okay? And here's where I can point out one of the potential problems of memorization. Rote memorization is a way to learn information. However, when you use rote memorization, the problem is you're not really linking it to information that's already in LTM. So you're kind of throwing that information into a filing cabinet, but you don't know exactly where you put it. So when it comes time to remember that information for the test, you can't find it. It's in there, but you can't find it. And that's retrieval failure. Okay? So that's my second take-home point. As far as the third take-home point, it involves automatic versus effortful encoding, automatic versus effortful processing. Most of the processing that we do when we're really learning something like information for a class or nuances of a new skill, that's effortful processing, meaning that it takes time, meaning that it takes repetition, meaning that it takes practice. And something that might happen quite often is that we think that most learning actually entails automatic processing. Now we'll just get it, we'll just remember it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So, as far as advice for you in test taking and future courses or learning new skills, that effortful processing would entail actually overlearning information, trying to think of examples of information, apply it to yourself, apply it to others in your life. Really think about it so you know it for the long term. So those are my take-home points for the memory chapter, and I will see you for the next take-home points.